Okay, so I think we better get a start. It's a little 5 minutes past the hour. I just want to thank all you brave people for coming out here in this weather. Very well done. Now, this peace lecture is the 18th one, and it wouldn't have been able to take place at all without the support of the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group, the Otago University Chaplaincy, and the Centre for Global Migration. Now, the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group has been in existence for 20 years. It was formed when 9/11 happened, and it was basically formed with 3 religions, being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, the idea there was that if there was an attack on any one religion, it would be as if there was an attack on all of them. And I think that this concept was a first at that time worldwide. So it just proves good ideas come from Dunedin. Okay, now, one of the aims of the group at the time was, why not have, it would be very appropriate to have a peace lecture. And they did have a peace lecture, and it was so successful that they decided to have one every year from then on, and alternate between the 3 religions. This year, it is the Jewish turn to have the peace lecture. And this one is the 18th one. And funnily enough, 18 is quite significant in Jewish terms, because in the Hebrew alphabet, the letter Chai means 18. So I just thought this was very significant, and 18 means life. So where there's life, we're really aiming for peace. Okay, now the thing is that there's no way that I could have put this together without the help of a terrific committee. And I just wanted to name that committee and acknowledge them for the wonderful job they did to put this together. And they are Hazel Mod Husseini, Reverend Greg Hewson, Najib Lefray, Reverend Dr. Jordan Redding, Emily Zwartz, Reverend Olivia Dawson, Angela McCarthy, and Reverend Ken Baker. And I just really want to thank those people for putting in the effort to put this together. Okay, so at this point, what I'd like to do is to welcome the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Helen Nicholson, to welcome you all on the behalf of the university and also introduce the speaker.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina iwi me na hoewha, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Helen Nicholson tōko ingoa, te tumu whakarai taupua te whare wanaka o Otago. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora, my name's Helen Nicholson and I'm the Acting Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 18th Annual Peace Lecture. And I'm delighted that we can hold this event, albeit physically distanced and live streamed. But despite the presence of Delta, the strain of COVID, we can still carry on and have this peace lecture. So welcome to you all. And I too would like to thank the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group, the campus chaplains, and the Centre for Global Migrations for hosting this event. Now, the University of Otago is New Zealand's oldest university, founded in 1869, founded by forward-thinking Scottish Presbyterian men. But since its establishment, it's welcomed men and subsequently women of all faiths. And interestingly, our first female graduates in the medicine and law came from a Jewish tradition. So Dr. Emily Seiderberg, who graduated in medicine in 1896, was the daughter of a Jewish architect, and she practiced here in Dunedin, and she dedicated her life to welfare and community work. Ethel Benjamin came from an Orthodox Jewish family and graduated with an LLB, a law degree, a year later than Emily in 1897. So as a university, we welcome diversity, both in the past and in the future and now. Now, Ruth has already provided some background to the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group, and so it's my pleasure to introduce our lecturer for today, David Zwartz, who's come down from Wellington to join us this evening. So David Zwartz was awarded an ONZM for services to the Jewish and interfaith communities in 2020. David was president of the New Zealand Jewish Council and co-founded the Wellington Jewish Council. He was appointed an honorary consul from Israel to New Zealand in 2003. David has been active in the fight against anti-Semitism. He helped institute annual United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremonies around the country and continues to facilitate this event in Wellington. He volunteers with the Holocaust Centre as a writer and presenter and has assisted with the publication of Anne Frank's diary, Interfaith. He was editor on the editorial board of the New Zealand Jewish Chronicle and a presenter of Jewish programmes on community radio since 1982. So as you can see, he's a very busy man. And David strives to bring people together to help to explain to each other how their faiths and their beliefs can go towards making a more harmonious New Zealand society. David, we look forward to your lecture, and I'd now like to hand back over to Ruth.
David will give his talk in a moment, and after his talk, we have three panelists here representing the three faiths, and they in turn will give their responses to David's talk. And then after they have then done that, then we will invite questions from the audience to the speaker. Okay? Now, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists. The first is the Jewish panelist, David Friedberg. Danny Friedberg, my apologies. Now, Danny is a researcher and practitioner of conflict resolution, and for the past 2 decades, he's been involved in mediation, consensus, building and dialogue work, both in Israel-Palestine, his country of origin, and internationally. He has a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies from the University of Otago, and he is a research affiliate of the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies. In his current role, Danny is a learning and teaching specialist at Otago Polytechnic, where he is launching a new graduate diploma in conflict resolution in 2022. Okay, then the Christian one, Rachel Toombs, grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in the years that followed the Good Friday Agreement. Rachel is a recent alumni of the University of Otago, completing a Master of Arts in History earlier this year. Her research, which focused on sexual violence in New Zealand history, was in part inspired by facilitating sexual violence prevention workshops on campus throughout Te Whare, Te Wharo. Rachel is currently working for the Red Cross, Dunedin, as the trainee in the Refugee Support Volunteer Program. The Muslim representative is George Lethbridge. He was born in Wellington and converted to Islam around 3 years ago, following a period of religious discontentment which saw him dabbling in several religions. He was drawn to the feeling of peace and purpose he found in Islam, the values of brotherhood, and the sheer beauty of the religion and Quran. Since then, he has sought to give back to the community, which has culminated in his being elected as president of MUSA, which is the Muslim University Students Association, for 2022. And George is currently studying geography at the University of Otago. Okay, so now I give you David Zwartz, our guest speaker.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Vice-Chancellor. E koe te tui, e kete te kaka, e kuku te kereru. The tui chatters, the kaka gabbles, the kereru coos. I don't offer an opinion on matching the three birds with the three Abrahamic faiths, but in an ideal world, all their distinct voices are heard loud and clear. I'd like to begin by thanking the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group for inviting me to present its 18th annual lecture. It's an honor to be included in a group of distinguished politicians, theologians, religious leaders, and academics, since the first lecture was given in 2004 by the late former Prime Minister David Longy. I don't fit into any of those categories, so please bear that in mind when it comes to the time for questions. In my talk, I want to explore what is kindness, how it contributes to peace in our communities, and how it can be increased. What is peace? This has been addressed and discussed in many different ways in the previous 17 annual lectures. To explain the Jewish tradition, as I said, I'm not a theologian, I'll repeat the gist of what Emeritus Professor Paul Morris said in his lecture, the third in this series, in 2006. He based his understanding of it on the meaning of the Hebrew word shalom, referring back to Psalm 34, which says, "Depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." Paul explained that peace is a journey that you have to look for and then follow, rather than a project to be erected. Good is something that we can do, but shalom is something we have to seek and pursue. Shalom is a word rich in resonance, from the root shalom, to complete, finish, be whole, and it connotes completeness, safety, friendship, welfare, health, prosperity, righteousness, and peace. Shalom is thus not simply the absence of war, but a positive quality, a life that is complete and full. The biblical tradition understands that the biblical tradition understands this shalom to be a blessing. In Hebrew, the standard greeting is Shalom Aleichem, peace be upon you. And the rabbinic tradition teaches that there is no higher blessing than that of shalom, Paul said. This is a shared Abrahamic concept. The universal Muslim greeting, Salam Alaikum, peace be upon you, is based on the Quranic concept of salam, peace, safety, and security. The concept is, of course, also well known to Christians from the Christian Bible. These understandings of peace and the aspirations to achieve it are not confined to the Abrahamic faiths. They're central to all faiths in this world. As practice of the Abrahamic faiths is based on scriptures dating back about 2,600 years for Judaism, about 2,000 years for Christians, and about 1500 years for Islam, there has been time for changes in interpretation and observances following the profound changes in human society over the millennia. But the concepts of peace and its universal desirability have survived unchanged over time and are also observed by people who are not affiliated to any faith. Jewish commentators teach that while it is easy to love shalom and earnestly desire it, it will not just arrive, but has to be actively pursued. Peace requires action. Examples of such action were given by Reverend Greg Hewson, who is here this evening, in the second annual lecture in 2005. He explained that the responses to the dropping of the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima in 1945, the events of 9/11 in 2001, and the founding of the Dunedin Jewish, Christian and Muslim Community Liaison Group, also in 2001, led to renewed activity to strive for peace. My presentation this evening on pursuing peace does not relate to peace at an international level, to conflicts between nations, but considers peace at national and domestic levels. In fact, the term peace at the international level is not always clear and is sometimes misused or abused. History gives us examples of how political leaders have used intervention and aggression in the name of peace. NGO peace movements are sometimes very aggressive in their calls for intervention in overseas situations, but I won't go into that this evening. Peace at national and domestic levels refers to absence of conflict between groups within a society, such as employers' associations and trade unions, tenants and landlords, Pākehā New Zealanders and immigrants, or between neighbours or within families. My thesis is that kindness by individuals is a powerful force in achieving peace at those levels. Individual kind actions have a cumulative effect that builds up a virtuous cycle which can change our families and our society. What is kindness? It's studied and given different definitions by a wide range of social scientists, anthropologists, psychologists, and religious commentators. The reasons why it exists in human nature are also explained differently by different experts. It is agreed, though, that humans are social animals and that we would not have survived as a species if we hadn't relied on each other, shared resources with others, and cared for them. The negative side to that is the parallel development of tribal behaviours which labelled the others, in quotation marks, as outside our range of concerns, in fact, as enemies. The development of aggression is also part of human nature, also based on survival. Kind behaviour has been analysed to show two distinct types, altruistic and strategic. Altruistic is when the kindness is selfless, no reward is expected. Examples are standing up to give your seat on a bus to someone else who you don't know, who is elderly or infirm, or offering to carry their heavy shopping bag, or giving your time to stand with a collection tin on behalf of an animal welfare organisation. Strategic kindness occurs when the person gets some sort of reward, either physical, monetary, or intangible. Examples are public recognition for philanthropy, or the worldwide Live Aid concerts in 1985. These were fundraisers to alleviate famine in Ethiopia. People attended to support a good cause, but knew at the same time that they were going to get an exciting musical experience. Both types of kindness, altruistic and strategic, achieve goodness and betterment for others. There is also what's called thinking well of someone, forming a kind attitude or opinion which isn't necessarily linked to a particular physical act of kindness. Incidentally, some recent neurological research has shown different brain reactions for the two sorts of kindness, which may indicate some sort of evolutionary development distinction. There's a growing popular movement encouraging random acts of kindness that began in the United States in the 1980s. It's also now formalised in New Zealand since 2005 as an annual day on the 1st of September. For the recipient, the randomness lies in the unexpectedness, someone or something kind appearing out of the blue. For the giver of the kindness, it is a randomness in selecting recipients, though there is intentionality in planning the nature and the number of acts of kindness, and this implies an aim of gaining some satisfaction for themselves, which is an element of strategic kindness, though linked to this is the hope that through random acts of kindness in general will spread. Since the first COVID-19 lockdown last year, our Prime Minister has exhorted the team of 5 million New Zealand citizens to be kind. People responded to the Prime Minister's call with a big increase in altruistic kindness. We saw this, for example, in greatly increased voluntary food donation and distribution. As someone living alone, I experienced such kindness myself, with many regular offers of assistance from neighbours to help with shopping and so on. The repeated requests to be kind were also aimed at minimising domestic violence, which is very prevalent in this country. It's actually the worst in the OECD. Under the very onerous lockdown restrictions which were imposed on all of us, any responses, however few, would have helped prevent an increase in violence in the home. Behaving more kindly was accepted by a large proportion of the population as being for the national good. This was altruistic kindness, since individuals were not being directly rewarded. Acting in the public good can also be seen as having elements of strategic kindness, since there is benefit from being a citizen in a community or a country which has been improved by the way that you have acted for the good. Sometimes there's a chain of actions which contributes to more peace in a community. For instance, contributing towards alleviating hunger, homelessness, or other symptoms of poverty will contribute towards reducing unhappiness and tensions in a household, which help reduce domestic violence. If that reduces, less money needs to be spent on policing and other social services paid for from general taxation. But I don't think that that is people's prime motivation for making a donation to a charitable organisation. What does motivate individuals to choose to be kind? People thought of as being basically altruistically kind do not need an organised random day to be kind, but there are differing opinions about whether kindness is an inherited trait or learnt from one's upbringing. The same discussion surrounds the opposite characteristics of human nature, such as selfishness and aggression. The noted Canadian-born psychologist Steven Pinker discusses human nature in his 2011 published book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is a quotation from Abraham Lincoln's presidential inaugural address. Pinker argues that violence, including tribal warfare, homicide, cruel punishments, child abuse, animal cruelty, domestic violence, lynching, pogroms, and international and civil wars has decreased over time. Pinker considers it unlikely that human nature has changed. In his view, it's more likely that human nature comprises inclinations towards violence and other negative traits, and other inclinations that counteract them, and those are the better angels of our nature. Being kind is choosing to listen to the better angels and learning not to listen to the others that will always be present. His book responded to criticisms that if it's true that our DNA predisposes us to be violent and nasty behavior, then humankind must be fated to continue being nasty to each other forever. He wanted to show that that is not true, for which he presented ample evidence. His book is very fat, and showed that there is ample reason for hope and optimism. How do Pinker's arguments and facts relate to us as people of faith? Our religions teach us to choose kindness and avoid unkindness or animosity. Equally important is the fact that non-religious people also have moral and behavioral codes that value kindness. For both groups, those of faith and also those of not faith, that is the equivalent of Pinker's better angels of our nature. This is very relevant in New Zealand today, since successive censuses have shown a decline in the numbers of people affiliated to organised religions, now down to less than half of those who answered that census question. Despite the trend over the centuries that Pinker described, sadly, we still have violent religious conflict today, such as in parts of Africa and against the Rohingya and Uyghur people. However, it may surprise some people here this evening to hear that in the time of my youth, which I admit was a certain time ago, here in New Zealand at the local level, there was considerable division between religious communities. And I knew of families who were split apart because of a Protestant Catholic intermarriage. In New Zealand now, those situations have almost disappeared, and there is now warm cooperation between communities of different faiths, as well as an active and productive interfaith movement based on the attitudes of kindness from faith leaders and kindness of individuals within the faith communities. Even as the number of adherents to faiths in New Zealand have declined, the achievements of the interfaith movement have grown. There was huge sympathy for and kindness towards the Muslim community following the tragic massacres of worshippers at the Christchurch mosques in March 2019 by other faith communities and by the general public. A major change, which I think falls within the definition of increased kindness in an overall sense, is the growing acceptance of Treaty of Waitangi settlements and justice for the tangata whenua. That's a rather generalized comment, perhaps, on a complex historical situation. And there are several factors that set against my sense of overall national change in this area being influenced by increased kindness. One is the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975 and the extension of its jurisdiction by the David Longi-led government in 1985. Another is the influence of three outstanding individual politicians who held the relevant portfolios: Sir Douglas Graham, the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, and Andrew Little. Again, there is now more intermarriage, and younger generations of Pākehā with greater understandings of tikanga Māori, which they got through their education. something that did not exist for my generation. Another is the major growth of empowerment and skill of the iwi in their negotiations. But all of these factors would not have succeeded unless the mood of the country as a whole had changed. Social reforms can accomplish positive things only when a country's climate of opinion has changed to accept them. In my opinion, the same increase in national kindness has underpinned major reforms such as homosexual relations law in 1986, anti-smacking legislation in 2007, and the Same-Sex Marriage Act in 2013. Global migration has affected New Zealand society in many ways, which have also elicited increased kindness. People move from one country to another for different reasons. Sometimes they seek to improve their economic situation. Sometimes they're specifically recruited for their skills by the government or by businesses. Some are refugees escaping oppression and death, such as Jews escaping Russian pogroms and the Nazi Holocaust. Also Assyrian Christians fleeing oppression in Iraq, Vietnamese and Syrians escaping from civil wars, and now people from Afghanistan. Global migration is likely to grow too as the planet is increasingly affected by climate change. New Zealanders have responded with kindness, setting up such organisations as the Refugee and Migrant Service, Refugees as Survivors, and Change Makers. Though there have been problems of integration for refugees and migrants, many Kiwis, themselves with a migrant heritage, have responded with assistance and kindness. More sympathy for refugees led to the successful advocacy for doubling the quota of UNHCR refugees accepted by this country. The resettlement program, managed by New Zealand Red Cross, relies on the kindness and support of volunteers to help refugee families for at least a year after their arrival in this country. All the changes I've mentioned have brought social inclusion and social harmony to Aotearoa New Zealand, which are major components of domestic peace and of the striving for that shalom which I mentioned earlier. The justice and correction systems are part of New Zealand society where Pinker's better angels are struggling to overcome the opposing forces of entrenched legal traditions and racism. More enlightenment and kindness are badly needed, especially as the opposing forces have been strengthened by the huge growth and influence of social media. There is justifiable hope here, though, in the activities of reform-motivated NGOs, and I mention particularly the NGO Just Speak, led by young, intelligent, practical and vigorous reformers whose sympathy for and kindness towards those in the justice and correction system has already achieved significant reforms. David Longy said in his closing address in 2004, in the closing of that address, one teaching is found in every religious faith. A great deal follows from it in the secular as well as the religious world. It's the rule of behaviour which tells us that we must treat other people the way we would like to be treated ourselves. He said, I commend all of you in the Dunedin Community Liaison Group for the practical effort you are making to live according to that rule. I said at the beginning of my talk that the questions you asked about peace had been asked forever. That rule has always been the answer, and it is the only answer I can give. This so-called golden rule exists in both a positive form, treat others in the same way you would like others to treat you, and a negative form, do not treat others in ways that you would not like to be treated. It exists in either or both forms in every world religion or culture, and has been with humankind since ancient Egypt and Confucian China. New Zealand society has changed in the 20 years since Longi referred to the Golden Rule as his only answer. Now we're more secular, we're less equal, we're more individualist, and more subject to being negatively influenced by social media. I have a few reasons for saying that the Golden Rule is no longer enough to be the only answer on the path to peace. It's mostly communicated directly through faiths, and it will have less impact as adherence to faiths declines. And there's always part of every population which doesn't want to live by rules or gets satisfaction from opposing them. And then the Golden Rule is also labelled as the ethic of reciprocity. So it can be interpreted as a sort of steady state guidance, a response rather than an initiative. For me, it doesn't carry the sense of striving for improvement that making a choice to be kind has embedded in it. How will we ensure that progress continues to generate a community and national climate of greater kindness? Here are a few thoughts. A response to the call for more school-level teaching of what used to be called civics would encourage a sense of citizenship which leads to encouragement in taking action for the public good, not only for personal benefit. Wider explanation and understanding of whanau natanga will also help. Please put up your hand if you're already vaccinated against COVID-19. Did you get vaccinated only because you want to protect your own health and safety? Or did you also have feelings that you're helping to protect your family, your neighbours, friends, and the whole country? I see that as an act of kindness, both strategic and altruistic. Another way of increasing acts of kindness is to speak publicly about it and encourage people to be kind, as Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has done consistently, and it has a positive effect. Young people have given us examples, such as through the Student Volunteer Army, founded by Sam Johnson, which engaged in large-scale communal kindness after the 2011 Christchurch earthquake. Mainstream media news items often publish accounts of misfortune, whether from acts of violence or through accidents and natural disasters. I've noticed more of them ending up with mention of a Give a Little page set up to help those who have suffered. And as the results show, the amount of money which has been donated, these references are a conduit for more acts of kindness. Our government has appealed to the country to act as a team for the good of everybody in our present pandemic situation. In future, it can do the same to encourage kindness on other occasions and for similar aims. What I think and have explained about kindness sustains my aspiration for more of us, members of the Abrahamic faiths and all other citizens of our country, to engage in acts of kindness in our country to make Aotearoa New Zealand a more peaceful place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David Zwartz. I'd like to now invite Daniel Friedberg to come up and give his response.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, David. It was eye-opening listening to you. And I would like to share some thoughts perhaps that occurred to me while I was reading your transcript of your lecture a few days ago, and then today again listening to that. And perhaps I will speak not so much in the name of Judaism, but in the name of my other religion, social sciences. Similarly to doctors being very focused and much more aware to illness rather than health, peace-building practitioners are more aware to the lack of kindness in humans, because this is where they're most needed. And the big question, of course, when we come to deal with conflicts, with saving people's lives, with changing people's minds and transforming areas of conflict, is how to make people more kind, how to make them put aside all the hatred and the anger and the things they've carried out over generations that keep conflicts around the world fueled and lasting, unfortunately. And listening to you, it brought me back to a very famous quote by Mahatma Gandhi that speaks about the need to battle war, or to wage war on war, with spreading love. And what Gandhi says is that the main tool for us to move forward in challenging war and generating this love is to raise children in a loving manner, through a loving disposition, I guess, of their parents. And this means to me, when I read your lecture, it struck me that the love that Mahatma Gandhi speaks about is actually the kindness you speak about. And when I take this idea of Gandhi that children need to be nurtured through love to become then loving adults who can deter or fight war, it occurred to me that what he really meant is that it needs to start somewhere. It needs to start by the responsible adults, or the people or the countries who are willing to take the initiative and be the first ones to preach for love or preach for kindness. And this, of course, brings back to the reference you make to Prime Minister Ardern and the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group. And really, when I just arrived in Dunedin about 7 years ago, and I was welcomed and invited by the Abrahamic Interfaith group to join, I think that this idea of we are the responsible adults, we're making the first step in spreading kindness without expecting anything in return, just hoping that it will be forwarded by everyone else affected by it, really brought me into this idea. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and listening to you.
Thank you, Danny. Now I'd like to call upon Rachel Toombs to give the Christian perspective.
Kia ora. Thank you, David, for what you've said. And thank you to the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith group for inviting me to respond. I was briefed that I have about 5 minutes, so I have about 5 minutes. I wanted to add my thoughts to 3 ideas that David shared about peace and kindness. Peace is a journey, peace requires action, and kindness at an individual level is a powerful force. And my comments are informed by my own experience, where I grew up and what I've studied. Also, a quick warning that my thesis studied marital rape, and I'll be sharing briefly some information on that in my 3rd point. Firstly, that peace is a journey. I grew up in Belfast in the years that followed the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. The agreement brought the end, perhaps, of decades of sectarian political violence and established a devolved system of government where power was shared between loyalist, Protestant, and nationalist Catholic politicians. Those of us growing up in the 2000s who only knew Belfast in light of this agreement were nicknamed the Peace Generation. Of course, it's not so easy to move from conflict to peace in one generation. The landscape of the city still reflected the divisions. Only 1 in 20 children attended integrated schooling, and stories of loved ones who were lost during the Troubles were passed down and remembered with pain. The nickname symbolized an aspiration, and I think also a recognition, as David has said, that peace is a journey, a slow journey that does not end in our lifetimes but continues through generations to come. I have lived in Aotearoa, New Zealand for 6 years, and while the history of conflict here is not always so obvious, I think that a slow journey to reconciliation, one generation at a time, still might have some resonance. Secondly, that peace requires action. Across Northern Ireland are around 20 miles of peace walls, giant concrete structures running through communities that have past been flashpoints of violence. The idea is that the walls are tall enough that nothing can be thrown over the top of them. The walls have been painted all over, murals, graffiti, and thousands of messages from people all around the world. My favorite message that I remember from when I was younger is the really simple, peace begins with a smile. One small act of kindness which begins the chain of peace. This action is something within our reach, even with a mask on our face. You can tell when someone's smiling. So in small ways, sometimes it's easy to be kind. Recently, the UK government announced their intention to ban all prosecutions related to the Troubles. This cuts off an avenue of resolution for thousands of civil claims that are currently lodged. Apparently, the intention of the UK government is to draw a line under the Troubles and move Northern Ireland further along the road of reconciliation. Thousands of incidences of violence, much of which has been perpetrated by the army and police, which will now not be recognised through legal means. Ignoring and moving on is not the kind of action which brings peace. It's not really an action at all. Acknowledging the pain caused and finding ways to repair the ongoing damage is an action. Unlike a smile, these acts of kindness are not always easy ones. Acknowledging the underlying reasons for many of the issues of injustice, which David referred to, is the tricky part. Although it's still within our reach, and our faith reminds us that. You have to want to do it, but we know with hope it is not impossible. And then finally, that kindness at an individual level is a powerful force to change families and societies. For my MA here, I studied the criminalization of marital rape. From the 1890s to the 1980s, husbands had legal immunity for spousal rape in New Zealand. One of the reasons reform took so long, I believe, was because the majority of politicians, lawyers, police officers, and judges, those who held the power in our reform system, they were all men, or most of them were. Their perspective was often more closely attuned to the accused husband than the wife experiencing the violence. And instead of the golden rule, which David challenged in the closing of his talk, we must treat others in the way we would like to be treated, I want to suggest that kindness requires of us to think firstly of the ways that we are different from others, and first of those who are different from us before ourselves. The basic kindness the politicians in the 1980s thought not just of the husband, but also of their wives, led to wives receiving legal protection from this severe violence. But they needed some activists to prod them into exercising this basic kindness. Together, the prodding and acknowledgement of difference became that powerful force, one person at a time, to change their mind for legal reform. We are not all the same, and kindness requires us to consider that and treat others, perhaps, the way they would like to be treated. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rachel. Indeed. Now I'd like to call on George from the Muslim side to give your version.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I'd like to thank David for a beautiful speech, which raised some really important points, or at least I found them very, very valuable. And I'd like to thank the panelists as well for their remarks, which have added on to this. I'd also like to thank the Abrahamic Interfaith Council for getting everyone together here. I think all of this really represents what this piece is. So peace is something which has a really core role within the religion which I follow, which is Islam. We heard in David's speech that this concept of shalom, which in Arabic is salam, comes from the root shalama. In Arabic, that is from the letters sin, lam, mim. These are the same letters, in fact, which our faith, Islam, it's based off the same letters. It comes from this same core word. And so, to us, peace truly is a core value. It is a core part of what we believe in. In fact, within the Islamic tradition, Allah, one of his 99 names, is actually As-Salam, the peace, the bestower of peace. Sorry. So, as you can see, this is a very core thing, and the focus on kindness, I believe, to be an essential part of peace. Because what is peace? We talk a lot about peace as in world peace, global peace, but in our lives, that kind of peace between nations doesn't directly affect us that much, does it? Instead, peace is peace in the household. In my case as a student, it's peace in the flat. It's that feeling of knowing that I can go downstairs without having to fight with my flatmates over who ate my food. It's these small interpersonal kindnesses which make peace part of our daily lives. And this sort of thing is, again, a core part of all of these religions. In Islam, we have a saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that is, every act of kindness is an act of worship. And in fact, in another one, we even hear that who is it that hellfire is banned from? Who is it who cannot make it into hell? It is the man who is kind, who is available to his friends, who is open and accessible, and who is polite. So these kinds of individual kindnesses are a core part of all religions, and they are a core part of what it means to be at peace. And what I also found very valuable was that discussion of the two sorts of kindness, that is altruistic and strategic. In our tradition, what we actually hold is that these two are very different, and I found it quite interesting that is actually shown within the brain. But basically, what you're rewarded for is your intention. If I go out and give $1 million to 1 million people, that doesn't add up to much to either of them, but you get the idea. If you go out and do a lot of it, but if the whole goal of it is to attract attention to yourself, everyone say, oh, that guy over there, he's great, he gives so much money, let's think he's cool. That doesn't actually give you any reward. We are, in fact, exhorted to give money or give and keep it secret. If the secret of what we've done is known only to us and to God, that is where the reward lies. And I think that is a true message, because it's easy to be kind when everyone's looking. It's easy to wear a mask out in public because people know it, but it's a lot harder to show that kind of same deal of kindness and concern for everyone else when people aren't looking. And I believe that's the real key to peace. That's the real key to where it comes from, because if we can change our hearts, if we can turn our hearts towards this kind of peaceful kindness, then it will come out into the rest of the community. I'd like to thank everyone for their speeches and for the opportunity to speak here. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Each one of you have given something different to this particular peace lecture, and I thank you, each one of you, for your contributions. Now I'd like to ask the audience if you have any questions that you would like to direct towards our guest speaker, David Zwartz, or perhaps any of the panelists. And if you would like to ask something, I would like you to stand and speak as loudly as you can so that we can hear it. And I'll try and repeat the question and then we'll get an answer. Is there anyone who'd like to ask anything? Yes, sir. Okay, so basically saying that your particular rule, being, kind to everyone, is that something that is actually in every religion, or is it something that actually comes from a person individually? Would that be correct, sir? Yeah.
I think individual response to that rule comes from being taught it in the first place. And the fact that it exists in so many, if not all, of world religions and cultures is because it has been seen so widely and over such a long time as a rule which has enormous truth and enormous benefits. I don't think it's necessarily innate, but all world societies and civilizations have adopted it because of the huge benefit that arises from behaving according to that rule.
Thank you, David. Is that okay with you, sir? Answered? Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Okay, so the question is, how has your thoughts on Holocaust, was the Holocaust one? Holocaust remembrance. Your work in your Holocaust remembrance had an influence on the subject of your talk today? Yep.
First of all, it reflects my personality, my individuality as a Jew, because although the Holocaust inflicted death on other groups of people than Jews, it was directed by the racial hatred that lay in Nazism specifically against Jews. So I feel it is something that I need to remember and respond to as a duty to the people of whom I'm a member. And the response is to the basic evil of what the Holocaust represented, what it did. And I think everybody would agree that even the best things that we hold dear in our lives, whatever they are, however they are related to us, for instance, by belonging to a religious faith, need reminding to us individually and to us as a society, because we forget things. We forget things as we grow older. We forget things because they don't form a central part of our lives. If you asked a Jew, how important to you is the Holocaust and what happened, unless they are themselves Holocaust survivors who directly experienced those awful things, they only know about what happened through reading about it, seeing videos, being spoken to, being taught. And those are all things which don't necessarily stick with us all the time. So remembrance as a regular event, I think, is an important part of remembering the evil so that we do not repeat it. And this has been acknowledged worldwide by the establishment of the United Nations International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is observed every year on the 27th of January, which was the day in 1945 when the Soviet Red Army liberated the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp, and when the true enormity of what Nazism had perpetrated became known to the rest of the world. The Holocaust Remembrance Centre in New Zealand has taken an attitude that the Holocaust should be remembered not only for its effect on the Jewish people, but also its effect on the other peoples who suffered, the Romani and Sinti people, who we know most commonly as the Gypsies, the homosexual part of the German population, and the disabled and mentally deficient members of the German population, all of whom were deliberately killed by the Nazis. This is not necessarily a worldwide view or a popular view. Many of the Jewish community worldwide think that Holocaust remembrance should be kept only to remembrance of how the Jews suffered, but the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand thinks that it is a universal message that needs to be remembered and acted upon, not just a message confined to the Jewish people. So with all of those reasons, I hope I've explained why I think the remembrance of the Holocaust leads directly to the message, never again, and that message carries with it all of the demands of maintaining peace so that it can never happen again.
Thank you, David. That answer it for you?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions? What you're basically asking is, you've got the altruistic and you've got the other. I've got the microphone on me.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Where you're asking, you've got the two, and as far as social media is concerned, wouldn't you actually advertise it anyway if you have done it? That's what you're really asking?
No, more that it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay to make it known that you have contributed.
It's a more modern way of looking at it because as much as from my faith base, I want to be quiet about my giving, I also want to be shown as a person that's stepping forward in social media and showing social justice and being kind in that respect as well.
Okay, so you want the recognition that you actually have given, that you actually, and that is your contribution to being kind. Is it with that? Understand that? Okay, right, David.
I'm not a good person to fully answer your question because I take no part whatsoever in any of the social media. So when I spoke about the negative influences, I was really repeating what many other people have said. And when I gave the example of media promoting kindness, I think I mentioned mainstream media, And in fact, that's information that I myself get from either newspapers or the radio. So I suppose it's just a generational defect on my part. But it's an interesting question because from what I've read or been told, the majority of personal opinion on the social media is negative rather than positive. Is that? Do you agree with that?
I disagree with that.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't really debate it with you because I don't have the full understanding. But
I think that it's our generation and younger generation. We have to be loud and kind and out there on social media to balance it. I don't think it's all negative. I think there's a lot of positive about being on social media, about the fact that I can talk to my friend in Brazil and check that he's okay during a COVID thing. You know, that's me being kind to some guy that I've never actually physically met. But it's kindness that that goes across borders. And I think it's important as Christians and people of the Abrahamic faith to do that, to reach out to those people on social media. So what I'm saying is it's a tool for positivity as well.
It's a little bit different.
Yes. But my understanding, which, as I've explained, is imperfect, is that the major influencers on social media are people like Kim Kardashian, rather than people who proclaim the better angels of our nature.
I think we have different friends lists.
So what she is asking is, what is the attitude of the Israeli government to the Palestinians and how that fits in with your philosophy of kindness?
I think the actions of any government can be measured against either kindness or lack of kindness, and I don't feel that the Israeli government is different from worldwide governments in that respect. They are all open to criticism for their attitudes and their actions.
Right, well, so this is a question directed to Danny, so you come up, Danny. So what is the position of kindness in relation to what you were talking about, Danny?
Thank you for your question. To start my response, and I will try to make it brief, I am a conscientious objector from the IDF. And as one, in my entire, the IDF is the Israeli Defense Force, or the Israeli military. So I served as a soldier, and then I became a conscientious objector, among other things, because of things like the issue that you've raised. And I hope that by saying that, and not going into too many details, it will disclose of where I am in this debate. I think the question that refers to people about kindness, about love, about wanting a better life becomes distorted when it comes to political structures, and perhaps, David, you've insinuated to that. Many countries don't seem to be acting in the best interest of their citizens or the best interest of the people they're supposed to be serving. And personally, and this is of course not representing any other group or identity except my own, I don't approve of what Israel is doing, what goals it's trying to achieve or the policies it's carrying out. This is, of course, my own personal notion, and I'm very happy to use another opportunity to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Yes, sir.
And I'd like to ask all of the panel members how they feel that we can direct kindness in encouraging the opportunity to change your mind with the people that may object to having an injection into their bloodstream in today's pandemic situation. Because there is required to be, I believe, kindness in the extreme. If I could ask the panel to respond to that.
Wow, awesome.
Okay, so the question was, with regard to people objecting to or refusing injections. Okay, it's for all the panel. How does the kindness come into that towards the people who are refusing to have the injections into their system?
It allows them to change their minds.
And so how will kindness allow people to change their minds about their attitudes to people who don't do that? That's really what you're saying. Yeah, either way. Okay. Who would like to come up first? David.
I think this falls under the category of the public good, which I referred to, that as we live in a society which works best when we act for the good of the society as a whole, that we need to ask all of the citizens within that society to act for the benefit of the society, for the public good. And if the public good is threatened by a pandemic, then the kindness that as individuals we should observe, or we hope people generally do observe, and which I hope would increase within New Zealand society, would take into account the life or death situation of every member of the society. And if the science of pandemics and health call on us to behave in such a way that the health and benefit of all citizens is looked after, preserved as much as possible, then we can only, with the greatest amount of information and education and persuasion, ask anybody who objects to being kind for their fellow citizens to reconsider their situation, their opinions. I don't think we can reach the stage of compulsory vaccination, because that involves an act of aggression, but we can certainly do as much as possible, and probably more than we are doing at the moment, to persuade them to change their mind by using the argument I've just outlined, that it is something that they are being called on to respond to for the benefit of society as a whole.
Thank you, David. Would anyone else like to respond? George?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that, when we associate something like vaccination and refusing to be vaccinated with the idea of conscientious objectors, my mind actually thinks back to another issue where people were forced to, make some sacrifices for the common good. If we think back to World War II, if we think back to something like the Blitz, this was a time where, for the greater good of the community, people had to do something which was at the time quite a big sacrifice. You had to, turn your lights off. People had to ration their food. But there was this understanding that, sure, it might suck now, but do you know what sucks worse? Getting bombed by the Germans. And much in the same way, the vaccination can be unpleasant. I've had the 2 vaccinations. It wasn't that bad for me, but I've had people who had to spend a couple of days in bed because they felt quite sick. But at the end of the day, do you know what's worse than 2 days in bed sick? Yeah, exactly. You spend a lot more days lying down in your coffin dead. And so while I can understand certain worries about the vaccine, sure, it's been quick. It hasn't been that. What we need to remember is no matter what, the vaccine is still very much tested. And of course, we should never be violent, or we should never be act in a hateful way towards those who are worried about it, because that's not going to help anything. Why do people have these views of sort of skepticism towards the vaccine? It's because they're skeptical of power systems, of the government, of it being pushed upon us. And so what's that? All that any sort of aggressive response will do is radicalize these beliefs, is entrench them. What we need to understand is that the reason that people don't necessarily want to be vaccinated isn't from some position of, ha ha ha, I will make people sick, but it's from a position of fear, of I don't want to have something in my body which I'm not sure about. And so it's only through, dissuading these fears. If we have a friend who's worried about doing something which is, we know it's good, but it's scary, we don't say, you're a horrible person, how dare you? We say, it's, sure, it's scary, I understand that. Personally, I was at first a little bit hesitant towards it, but it's only through that understanding that, sure, this may be, slightly inconvenient at the moment, but in the future, it will make things better. It's only through that kind of conveying that message of reassuring people and being understanding that you'll make any real progress. If we look to Europe, where they've tried to be very, forceful of it, all it's done is created societal division and anger. Only by, as the government said, being kind, only by listening to those who are worried and looking out for them, showing that, sure, what you're doing, I may not agree with it, but here's why. Here's why I disagree. Here's why you should do it, instead of just saying, I disagree, you're bad, now go. Only through that kind of encouragement and sort of inclusive disagreement and showing it, because obviously at the end of the day, I believe everyone should be vaccinated, but we're not going to get that across if we don't show the kindness which has been expressed today. So thank you for your question.
Thank you, George. That was very good. Does that answer your question? Does that answer that for you? That's great. Okay. Okay. All right. So, last question.
And Frank, in Somalian, how did you find, with your being kind and pursuing peace, the message of Anne Frank coming into the Maori language?
In the first place, I was not the actual translator. I was part of a group of people who thought that it was a worthwhile project and helped to bring it about. Because my professional career was in book publishing. But I understand that your question is, why did we think it was worthwhile doing, and perhaps what the effect might be. There are two answers to that. One was that the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand believes very strongly that the message of Anne Frank's diary is a very powerful one because of the circumstances in which it was written. A 14-year-old girl experiencing herself direct oppression and fear of extermination, which was in fact what happened, and unburdening her deepest thoughts about that situation, as well as some very frank and sometimes funny and sometimes deeply true opinions about her own parents and the families that she was hidden with. So it exists as a set of examples of human response to aggression and response to fear, and which I doubt if anybody in this room has had to face up to. So it is a very deep spiritual work as well. But also, at the same time, we wanted to widen the amount of literature which is available in Te Reo Māori for the benefit of New Zealand in terms of the spreading and understanding and use of the Māori language. So we thought that we were getting a double benefit by engaging in the translation and the publication.
Okay, David, I'd like you to stay standing. That's the end of the question time, and I would like to invite Reverend Greg Hewson to come on to give a presentation to David.
On behalf of us all, David, I'd like to sincerely thank you for coming from Wellington to share with us this message of peace and kindness. I was really pleased when you accepted our invitation. We have met before at national interfaith events in Wellington, and I've always been impressed by your kindness and by your gentle strength that comes through in the way that you speak as much as in the words that you share. And so we would all sincerely like to thank you. And we've got a few things here just to remind you of your visit. This is a University of Otago pen. No one else has seen the presents, you see. This is some writings on peace by our 2010 peace lecturer, Chaiwat Satya Anand, friend of Dr. Najib. We have here a Dunedin Otago calendar put up on your wall. This is a University of Otago compendium for you to continue to write and reflect and to remember us. And there's a University of Otago cup. And all of these things come from the shop just through there. So it's, including the bag, except for the card, which is signed by us all. So thank you very much. And also, just quickly, I have a small gift for Helen, our Vice-Chancellor, Acting Vice-Chancellor. Thank you very much for coming after hours. And a small gift for our cameraman, Don Newstub. Don has been faithful over many years in live streaming our lectures and is retiring later in the year. And so we do sincerely thank you, Don, as well. So I'll bring these to you.
Thank you, Greg. So now I'd like to call on Reverend Dr. Jordan Redding to present the presentations to the panelists.
Greetings, my name's Jordan, one of the chaplains at Otago University. It's good to see you all, both here and those who are joining us from afar. It's fallen to me to give a vote of thanks to our panelists. This is an act of altruistic kindness on our part, so the altruistic kindness on your part, and an act of strategic kindness on the part of the university shop, I think. But it's become part of the tradition to not only have a very quality guest speaker, but accompanying the guest speaker, a quality panel to offer their thoughts, to broaden up the conversation, to allow space for us to think and formulate our own thoughts, and you've each done that in your own way. I think each of your contributions tonight have been superb. And so George, Rachel and Danny, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. You want to give them out? You can do that. Definitely, yes. Yep.
Just before I hand back to Ruth, I would like to make one final vote of thanks to the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group, and especially to Ruth, the chair, and who has done a good job at chairing the event tonight. So Ruth, for your work and for the work of the Dunedin Abrahamic Interfaith Group, thank you for 18 years of life. Here's to another 18.
Well, thank you, Gordon. Well, thank you very much for being such a good audience. And what I'd like to do is invite you all to supper at All Saints Church Hall just up the road. You are all most welcome. Thank you very much.